Okay, so as a compromise, we're just going to start, and I'm just going to do German and English. Oh, apparently it's running. Okay, never mind. I think it's running. Maybe people can give us a yay, it's running. Okay, perfect. Cool. Welcome, everybody. Welcome if you're here for the first time. Welcome here if you have been here before. We're super glad to have all of you. First of all, there is a German translation room that is now running. You'll find it in the stream notes, and I think moderation is also going to pass it in there again. Yes, there's also an awareness room because the topics today might be heavy for some people, so you're welcome to join the awareness room and talk to people there and kind of tell us how you would feel safer or better. Our lecture series. This is our lecture series on climate and the right. Today's topic is right-wing ideologies around overpopulation, and we're super glad to have Professor Peter Staudenmaier with us today, and I'll introduce him in a minute. We're reaching the middle of our event series. We only have 3 left, but I think the last 3 ones are going to be really good. So I'm super happy that the resonance is so good and that all of you are here today as well. Very quickly about this effort. We're a group of activists, and we're organizing this event to fight against to do anti-fascist and anti-racist fighting against right-wing tendencies in the climate movement. And we want to raise awareness about the different facets of this issue to make it compatible and make it something that we can all expel from this movement that we're all in. We want to ask the question, to which extent and where the climate movement carries right-wing and regressive ideologies and where it reproduces them. As I said, today we're going to talk about overpopulation with Peter Staudenmaier. He's a historian at Marquette University in Michigan. He researches German and Italian fascism, as well as the history of the environmental movement. He's also an activist. He's been active in the anarchist movement, the green movement, and the cooperative movement in the United States and in Germany. Today, his political home is the Institute of Social Ecology, about which he'll probably also say a few words later. He's written many very interesting books. It's actually quite fun to read your publication list, Peter, because many of the topics that we already talked about in lecture series are things that you actually wrote books about. So he has written one book about eco-fascism, lessons from the German experience, which has now just been republished as Eco-Fascism Revisited. He also wrote about the Rudolf Steiner movement in between occultism and Nazism, and he actually has a book coming out called Ecology Contested, Environmental Politics Between Left and Right. So I'm super, super happy that you're here today, and I'm glad to listen to you talk in a few seconds. We're going to close the chat now, so all of you can focus on the presentation. But again, feel free to join the awareness room or the translation room. There will be questions at the end, and we're going to curate them a bit, but in general, just as soon as we finish the talk, just go ahead and write your questions in chat. And first of all, I really want to thank you, Peter, but I also want to thank all the people behind the scenes who do the technical stuff, who do the awareness, who do the translation. We're super glad that you're here, and yeah, we're very happy that we can offer you this really cool talk. So with that, I'll stop talking and give you the word, Peter. Welcome, and yeah, thanks for being here.
Terrific. Thank you, Jakob. Thanks to Louisa. Thanks to Lara. She has the unenviable job of trying to translate me, and that's hard. I've done simultaneous translation, and it's a challenge. So thank you very much for those of you doing that. I can't see anyone else, so I don't know who's joining us today. I do speak German, as Jakob mentioned, which means that once I get to the end of my English presentation, if we wanted, we can figure this out then, but if we wanted, we could switch into having conversation in German. But I know that part of the point of your series has been to make it international. You've had my friend Hilary Moore on, you had Maya Goodfellow on, you've had other international presenters on, and that's really important with a topic like this, especially with the topic that I'm talking about today, the combination of overpopulation discourse with anti-immigrant forms of right-wing environmentalism. It's especially important to have an international perspective on these events. So thank you to all the organizers for making sure to do that. And thank you to everyone who's participating today, especially for those of you who are German. You're missing a very important soccer game right now, which I'm aware of. Last I checked, it was still 0-0. But for those of you who care about the German national team, this is bad timing. So my apologies for that. So I was gonna give you about an hour's worth, but we started late. So I'm gonna try to fit it into maybe 45 minutes without talking way too fast, which I sometimes do. But the three main questions that will frame my remarks today are fairly straightforward. And I'm not going to give you really good answers to those questions. I mean more that these are the forms of inquiry that I think should lead our way as we, as ecological activists, as left activists, as climate activists, that can lead our way through this really tricky terrain, this genuinely difficult and challenging topic of so-called overpopulation. Why has that discourse become such a prominent part of environmentalism more generally? And in my case specifically, what I study is the environmentalism of the right, sometimes of the far right. So my three framing questions are: one, what does right-wing environmentalism mean? Where does that even come from? Where does it come from historically? Where does it come from politically? That's important for us to understand. Second, where does the concept of overpopulation come from? Where does it come from historically? What are its political connotations? One of my arguments is that it's not just a right-wing concept, unfortunately. It's also been taken up by liberals and leftists and centrists and others. And then last but not least, why does this matter for ecological movements today? Why does this concept that extends back to the 18th century, actually extends back even earlier, but at least in its modern form extends back to 1798, why does it still matter? Why does it matter even more today in the 21st century than perhaps it has in the past? So those are my guiding questions. And to start us out, I want to ask us to think back just 2 years now to 2019. I know that feels like about 10 years ago now, since many of us have lived through a global pandemic. Some of us didn't make it through. People who are with us today have had a crazy couple of years, the past 2 years, but really just 2 years ago, in 2019, I want to begin with a series of horrifying attacks on immigrant communities. I know you all know about these two attacks, but just to refresh our memory a bit. The first attack happened in March 2019 in Christchurch, New Zealand, a lovely town where I've been on the South Island of New Zealand. And the second attack happened, that was in March 2019. The second attack happened a few months later in August of 2019 in El Paso, Texas, also a lovely city where I have been here in the United States. And those two attacks were closely related. In some senses, the second attack was kind of a copycat of the first one, and both attacks were perpetrated by white men against communities that they took to be somehow foreign, communities that the perpetrators saw as different and as other. In the case of the Christchurch attack, he targeted mosques, so his target was primarily Muslim communities. The El Paso shooter targeted people he took to be Latinx, which is a newfangled term we use in English these days. It refers to communities that come from Latin America originally, Central America, Mexico, South America, what have you. And in both cases, both of those perpetrators gave explicitly environmental reasons for their mass murders. These were very serious attacks. They killed 74 people in total. And they gave environmental justifications, so to speak, for undertaking these, for committing these atrocities. In the case of the El Paso perpetrator, I'll start with him first. Both of these shooters left manifestos online. There's a very important discussion going on among scholars, among journalists, among anti-fascist activists about whether we should even give those manifestos much attention. There is an important argument out there that says we should not, that I should not. I'm about to quote you from both of those manifestos. Some people would say I shouldn't do that. I understand those arguments. I don't share them in this case, but I want to respect that there are good reasons for being really careful with further giving more publicity to people who maybe don't deserve that publicity. Nonetheless, in this case, I think it's important for us to understand What was the disturbed logic that led these two perpetrators to do what they did? In the case of the El Paso shooter's manifesto, here's the key sentence that I find. His manifesto complains about pollution, it worries about resource depletion, it worries very explicitly about overpopulation. And the key line, in my view, is this: if we can get rid of enough people, then our way of life can become more sustainable. End quote. If we can get rid of enough people, then our way of life can become more sustainable. Now, I want you to keep in mind what kind of people he was getting rid of. Brown people. He viewed, this is a little bizarre for anyone who, if you have a basic understanding of the history of the southwestern United States, El Paso, right on the border with the Mexico, it's twin cities in Mexico, Juarez, right across the river. If you know a little bit about the history of that region, it makes absolutely no sense for a white man to view Mexicans as invaders in that part of the country, but that is how he and many other people viewed that situation. He meant to get rid of the brown people, then our way of life, by which I take it, I think he meant how he thinks white middle-class people live or ought to live in the United States, then our way of life can be made more sustainable. It's a classic example of a far-right version of environmental thinking, which in this case had directly murderous consequences. Even more chilling, in my view, is the Christchurch perpetrators manifesto. It is much longer. The Christchurch manifesto is a much longer text. It's more sophisticated, so to speak. It's nicely produced. It has a title. The title is The Great Replacement. That phrase has been circulating, especially on the European far right, for many years. It's one of the classic phrases. The Great Replacement is a classic phrase used by far right opponents of immigration. They think others are trying to replace us, if the us is the French people or the German people or whoever. So the Christchurch perpetrator called his manifesto The Great Replacement, and its opening lines are very telling. The first three lines of this long text reads, I'll read you the full three lines, it's the birth rates, it's the birth rates, it's the birth rates. So he repeats the same line three times over. That's the start. That's the beginning of this very long text. It's the birth rates. Now, what he means by birth rates in that context is the differential birth rates. That's a huge concern for far-right opponents of immigration, especially in Europe, and this guy was Australian. In the case of other parts of the global north today, the worry is that birth rates in a place like Germany, since many of you are from Germany, birth rates in Germany for, quote, Germans, for people who count as German, are decreasing. They're not increasing, they're decreasing. That's true almost across the board. For almost all European countries today. It's true in Italy, it's true in France, it's true in Britain, it's true in lots of different parts of Europe today, whereas birth rates for immigrant communities, in many cases, not all, but in some cases, those birth rates are rising. So his concern was the differential between the birth rates. His worry, to put it bluntly, is there's not going to be enough white people left if we don't do something to stop it. The scary thing is that, again, in this case, just like with the El Paso perpetrator, the Christchurch perpetrator framed this concern not just in racial terms, but explicitly in ecological terms. He gave a forthrightly environmentalist justification for his atrocity, for his act of mass murder. If you read the manifesto, and I'm not even necessarily recommending that you should, but for people who are willing and able to do that, to subject themselves to that, you'll see that the environmental theme runs straight throughout the text, from the beginning to the end. He calls for a green nationalism. In fact, he says, quote, green nationalism is the only true nationalism. He wants to stop what he calls the continued destruction of the natural environment through mass immigration. Those are his own words. Just to give you a sense of the tone of this manifesto, I'll read a couple of sentences from the middle of the text. Continued immigration into Europe is environmental warfare and ultimately destructive to nature itself. The Europe of the future is not one of concrete and steel, smog and wires, but a place of forests, lakes, mountains, and meadows. The culminating sentence in this manifesto, the one that really hit me the first time I read this somewhat repulsive text, the culminating sentence comes toward the end of the manifesto, and it reads, in full, two sentences, the culminating passage. It reads in full, quote, "The invaders are the ones overpopulating the world. Kill the invaders, kill the overpopulation, and by doing so, save the environment." End of quote. Once again, there's a reason why other anti-fascist activists, other scholars, other journalists warn against doing what I just did. There is a genuine concern that we could be giving too much attention to these perpetrators who don't really warrant it. I think, however, that I respect that, but I think it is extremely important to try to understand the distorted logic, the disturbed logic that went into these two actions, because I don't see these actions as exceptions, unfortunately. I agree that they were exceptional in their murderous violence. It's unusual for people who hold these views to go and shoot up a mosque or shoot up a Walmart, in the case of the El Paso perpetrator. But in reality, these are really just two of the more excessive, aggressive examples of a much broader phenomenon, the current convergence of far-right political beliefs with environmental concerns, nationalism, and anti-immigrant violence. That combination is becoming more and more prominent, not less and less prominent. And I see those two attacks from 2019 as unfortunately deadly expressions of a much more broadly shared mindset. And I think part of our job today is to try to understand that mindset to the extent that we can understand it. So today in Europe, in North America, in Australia, New Zealand, in many parts of the global north, in today's discussion, I'm going to use the terms global north and global south to talk about places that used to be called, when I was growing up, those places were called the first world and the third world, or sometimes the developing world. I'm going to call them the global north and the global south. So today, in many parts of the global north, far-right ecology consistently links overpopulation claims to anti-immigrant arguments, and especially argues for a close the borders rhetoric. That's a classic part of the arguments of the far right in France and in Britain and in the United States today. Build the wall, close the borders, stop letting the brown people in or the other people in, and somehow that will supposedly be better for, quote, our environment, for our natural world. Okay, so that's my starting point. I want us to understand that these are not just theoretical debates. I am going to talk a little bit about theoretical debates in a moment, but these are questions of life and death, people. These are not just abstract conceptual arguments. These arguments matter. They affect real people's lives in very, very concrete and very direct ways. But to understand how we got there, how did we get there in 2019 and 2021? How did we get to today's scene of far-right environmentalism and its sometimes obsession with so-called overpopulation? To understand that, I think we need to step back and take a longer historical view to give ourselves more historical perspective on those questions. The classic way to look at the beginnings of that discourse around overpopulation is to go back to 1798, to the very end of the 18th century, to a British writer, today you'd call him an economist, I suppose, Thomas Malthus. Malthus was also he was a pastor. He was a parson. He was an Anglican cleric, had a congregation and everything. And in 1798, Malthus came out with this now famous text called An Essay on the Principle of Population. Now, he's often put forward, and I have a lot of books stacked up here that I looked through to prepare my presentation today. And in most of those books, Malthus is presented as the founder of modern overpopulation discourse. Now, there's a lot of truth to that, but actually those ideas could be traced back longer. They didn't just appear out of nowhere in 1798. More importantly, in some ways, Malthus is not the best example of the kind of ideology that I want us to examine today. Malthus, for example, Malthus did not believe in birth control. He was an Anglican cleric. He thought that birth control was immoral, and that what poor people really needed to do was just control their own urges and stop reproducing so much. Malthus was not opposed to economic growth. On the contrary, he thought that economic growth was a good thing. His pessimistic analysis came from his assumption that economic growth would never be able to keep up with population growth. He thought that was sort of a natural law. So there's a lot of ways where what Malthus himself believed back in the late 18th century, early 19th century too, doesn't really match up with what his supposed followers today believe. Nonetheless, you will often see the term Malthusian or Malthusianism. That's a common term used in the 20th century and in the 21st century to describe people who are deeply concerned with ostensible overpopulation, with supposed overpopulation, because they trace that legacy back to Malthus, even though he didn't share a lot of their central beliefs. What I think is maybe the more important historical context for our purposes, the ones that tie directly into environmental concerns, I would say don't go back to 1798, go back more to the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, the latter half of the 19th century. That's where a lot of environmental historians would argue that that's the time when a recognizable form of modern environmentalism begins to emerge in places like the United States, where I live, in places like Germany, the country that I study, or one of the countries that I study, the country where the organizers of this series are, both in Germany and in the United States and in other parts of the world. I think the latter half of the 19th century is the real place to look for the historical roots of a recognizably modern form of environmental politics. And my point here is that those early forms of environmentalism, even at that very early stage, even as early as the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, those early forms of environmentalism already contained a crucial anti-immigrant streak. Not that the early environmentalists were necessarily worried about overpopulation on a global scale. There was some of that concern, but that really starts to kick in the 20th century. But already at that early stage, the founding mothers and fathers of the conservation movement, if you want to call them that, in Germany would say the Naturschutzbewegung, the movement for the protection of nature. Many of those early figures already back then held strongly anti-immigrant views. That is important for us we need to be honest about that. We need to recognize that fact. By the time we get to the 20th century, especially by the middle of the 20th century, the middle decades, let's say the 1940s and 1950s, to keep it simple, by then we get concepts like the notion of ecological carrying capacity. Very important term, carrying capacity. It was initially introduced to discuss non-human animal populations, zoologists and wildlife ecologists who studied various animal populations. They came up with this notion of the carrying capacity of a particular region for a particular species. And that term then got transplanted to talk about human communities. So ecologists in the middle of the 20th century began to talk about the carrying capacity of the planet as a whole. How many humans can the Earth possibly support? And you move very quickly, within about 2 decades, you move from that discussion of so-called carrying capacity to, in the 1960s, the discussion of the so-called population bomb. We'll come back and say more about that notion of a population bomb in just a minute here. But this is not something that just arose out of nowhere in the 1960s and 1970s. Its roots go further back. I would say that 2 of the most important origins are in the 1940s. I'll point to 2 books that are published in 1948 in English. I'm going to give two American examples for now. I'll discuss German examples in a minute. Those 2 books from 1948. The first one is by a guy called Fairfield Osborn, who's actually, at that time, a very well-known environmental figure. His book was called Our Plundered Planet. Our Plundered Planet by Fairfield Osborn, 1948. And a few months after his book came out, his sort of friend and colleague and rival, William Vogt, his book called The Road to Survival was published. And they both published in 1948, and they both sold very well. You may not recognize those names or those titles anymore, but back then those were pretty prominent parts of the then growing environmental consciousness, if you will. By the early 1960s, Osborn brought out another book, in this case a book that he edited. He didn't just write it himself. And that book from 1962 is titled Our Crowded Planet, Essays on the Pressures of population. So if you thought that this is a topic that really came into view first at the very end of the 1960s or the beginning of the 1970s, historically speaking, that's not true. There's a longer background there that is, I think, very important to understanding why did so many 20th century environmentalists get so obsessed with this notion of overpopulation. Okay, but let's jump to the late 1960s. Let's get to some of the famous examples that people in the US and in Germany have probably heard of, maybe talked about, maybe even read before. Two important texts come out, again, in English in 1968. One is by Garrett Hardin. Hardin was, at that time, in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, aughts, for a long time, Garrett Hardin was an extremely influential ecologist. He was a scientist who also took very strong political positions. And his famous 1968 essay was published in Science, the journal Science. That's a big deal. Most scientists would do anything to get their articles published in the journal Science. It's an extremely high-profile venue, extremely high-profile journal for natural scientists. So Hardin it wasn't just an op-ed piece that he sent to the New York Times or something like that. His famous article from 1968, published in Science, is called The Tragedy of the Commons. If we had more time, I would probably spend 15 minutes picking apart Hardin's arguments there because they're importantly influential and importantly false. They're both highly influential and extremely weak conceptually, and we should understand how does that happen? How do obviously flawed arguments end up having these enormous impacts on public consciousness? Maybe if we have time in the discussion, maybe we can come back to that. The book that really made a huge public impact a couple months after Hardin's article came out was by Paul Ehrlich. Again, another natural scientist, a biologist at Stanford University, which is a big deal. It's one of the premier universities in the United States. And his book in 1968 was called The Population Bomb. I shouldn't say his book. He co-wrote it with his wife, Annie Ehrlich, but it was only his name, only Paul Ehrlich's name is on the book itself. He claimed credit for it, even though he co-wrote it with his spouse. The population bomb. What you want to understand about that term, if you somehow never heard the term population bomb before, the point of that image is to think of the human global population as a ticking time bomb, a bomb that has not yet gone off, but it will go off. It will explode. The bomb supposedly will explode and destroy the planet or something, or kill all of us. I'm not sure what happens when the bomb goes off, but the idea here is that the bomb is going to go off if we don't do something right now. That was Ehrlich's whole argument. Paul Ehrlich made any number of very specific predictions, starting in the 60s, into the 70s, into the 80s, and beyond, where he would routinely predict things like in the early 1970s, just to choose an example. In the early 1970s, Paul Ehrlich predicted in public that by the 1990s, which for us now is 3 decades ago, and for him in the early 1970s, that was 2 decades in the future. In the early 1970s, Paul Ehrlich predicted that by the 1990s, hundreds of millions of people around the globe would die from famine, from natural disasters, from ecological collapse, and so on and so forth. So he wasn't shy about making these bold claims about just how far along the ticking time bomb of population supposedly was. And of course, he turned out to be wrong. And many of his predictions turned out to be readily falsifiable. History did not, in fact, turn out the way that he thought it was going to. But that did not detract from the influence of his ideas. The next important book that I want to mention very briefly from 1972 was by the so-called Club of Rome. That's a group of scientific researchers from various countries around the global north. And their book in 1972 is called The Limits to Growth. I want to make clear there's a lot of important things in The Limits to Growth. I am not dismissing all of the work that those thinkers did behind the Club of Rome. I do want to point out how important overpopulation was. Among the variety of concerns that they pointed to in The Limits to Growth, one of the major ones was overpopulation. That's why it connects to my discussion today. Last figure I will mention in the U.S. context as far as mainstream environmentalists go is a person who's not that well known in the public discussion. He's very well known among some environmental activists, but in the general, wider discussion, his name is not that famous because he didn't want to be famous. This was a guy who worked behind the scenes, was very, very good at establishing networks without himself becoming a high-profile public spokesperson. His name was John Tanton, Tanton, if you want to look him up. John Tanton just died a couple of years ago. He died in 2019, so just 2 years ago now, from the 60s through the 70s, through the 80s, through the 90s, through the aughts. Highly influential guy. What he did was bring together anti-immigrant forms of overpopulation rhetoric with mainstream environmentalists. He was brilliant at doing that. He had a real gift, unfortunately. He had a real gift for bringing those two camps together and forging these, in some cases, these long-lasting alliances between some mainstream environmentalists and the anti-immigrant faction of the overpopulation crowd. Now, those theories, all the figures that I just mentioned, Ehrlich, Tanton, Hardin, those are all pretty mainstream figures. And this idea gets radicalized in the United States in the 1980s, especially through groups like Earth First. I'm sure many of you have heard of Earth First. For all I know, some of you may have been involved in Earth First activism. To its credit, the group Earth First, which still more or less exists today, the group Earth First today is highly critical of its own founding generation. Today's Earth First has rejected most of or much of the ideology that the founders of Earth First were propagating back in the 70s and 80s. But back then, in the 1980s, the most famous name associated with the group Earth First was Dave Foreman. Foreman is still around today. He hasn't worked with Earth First for decades now. Foreman, the rise of deep ecology. There's a strand within international ecological thought that's called deep ecology that also arose in the 1980s, not accidentally. There's a lot of overlap. Foreman himself was and is a deep ecologist. There are other members of the Earth First crowd. One of the important ones in the 1980s wrote under a pseudonym, under a fake name, an invented name, a pen name. And the pseudonym that he chose was misanthropy. It's hard to translate for my German listeners today, but it is a play on the word, the regular English noun misanthropy, which simply means Menschenfeindlichkeit. The English term for Menschenfeindlichkeit is misanthropy. And if you break that word up into three words, it looks like misanthropy. It also suggests, by the way, that the author of these anonymous pieces was a woman. Miss and Anne suggest a woman author. It wasn't a woman, it was a man. His real name is Christopher Maines. He's still around today. He's still talking his environmental talk today. Back then, people like Foreman, Maines, aka misanthropy, the message they were sending in radical environmental circles, not just in the mainstream established environmental outfits, but in radical environmental circles like Earth First, the message they were sending was, for example, the AIDS epidemic. Back then in the 1980s, the epidemic on many people's minds was AIDS. HIV, the disease that HIV causes, AIDS. Today, we'd say the corona pandemic. I'm sure you're all aware of people who responded to the emergence of the pandemic last year by saying, humans are the virus. Corona is the cure. There was a similar logic back then around AIDS. People like Foreman and Christopher Maines, misanthropy, they would say that AIDS is a good thing because they thought it's going to radically lower the human population. The basic logic here, for Hardin, for Ehrlich, for Foreman, for the others, the basic logic here was to urge that the global north has to stop supporting countries in the global south. It has to stop sending them food aid, for example, to famine-stricken countries because they believe that would simply extend the human population growth and lead to utter disaster. So the upshot of all of these arguments from the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and onwards, the point of these arguments is that the problem, the supposed problem, the ostensible problem, the alleged problem, lies in the global south. These are uniformly thinkers from the global north saying that the problem lies in the global south. It lies in the countries of the global south. In fact, they're saying that the problem really lies in the most vulnerable communities in the global south, the most impoverished communities in the global south. And their conclusion for Foreman, for Ehrlich, for Christopher Manus, for misanthropy, et cetera, the conclusion was that poor people and people of color must be left to die. The only proper thing we can do for the planet is to leave poor people and people of color to die. That is not my critical interpretation of their works. That's exactly what they themselves said, explicitly at the time. Go look up some of their writings from the late 1980s and you will see what I mean. Okay, I promised I would give a couple of German examples before I completely run out of time here. The two main ones I would mention will be from the 1970s. There are examples from today's German-speaking Europe. If I had to pick one from the current scene, I guess I might point to Martin Sellner. He's actually Austrian. He's not German, but Austrians speak German, so he's got a lot of fans in Germany. Sellner he's sort of the poster boy for the so-called identitarian movement. Look him up online if you haven't heard of this guy. Martin Sellner, among many other things that he warns about the terrible consequences of modern Western civilization, he also warns against overpopulation. So this is it's not some purely historical aspect of right-wing environmental thought in a German-speaking context. Nonetheless, the two most important examples both happen to come from the 1970s, because that's really when this rhetoric of overpopulation took off in the public sphere. One is from Konrad Lorenz. I don't know how we say his name in English. Konrad Lorenz, very famous zoologist, studied animal behavior. He co-won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1973. Very big deal in the German context. Lorenz, the exact same year that he won the Nobel Prize, he also brought out the book I'm about to mention, 1973. And that book was called Die 8 Todsünden der zivilisierten Menschheit, the 8 deadly sins of civilized humankind. And he lists in the book what he thinks are the 8 mortal sins that supposedly civilized societies were committing. Guess what was number 1 on his list of 8 deadly sins? Overpopulation. That wasn't number 7. That wasn't number 8. It wasn't number 6. It's his number 1. Konrad Lorenz in 1973, his number 1 example of the 8 deadly sins of civilized humankind is overpopulation. That's how central this concept was then and remains today for right-wing environmental thought. The second example might be better known. It's from Herbert Gruhl, who is not so much a scientist as a politician. I happen to have a copy of his book right here, Ein Planet wird geplündert, from 1975. Gruhl was, at that time, a member of the CDU, of the Christian Democrats, the mainstream conservative party in Germany, the center-right party in Germany. He relatively soon after that left the CDU and went on to be a co-founder of the German Greens. And he's often seen as the standard barrier for the conservative factions within the early German Greens, 1978, 1979, 1980, 1981. He and the other right-wing Greens then left the Greens in the early 1980s because they thought the Greens had moved too far to the left. But he was a very important, very influential guy at the time. And that book that I just showed you, its title in English would mean A Planet is Being Plundered, which is remarkably similar to the title of the Fairfield Osborne book from 1948, Our Plundered Planet. There's a lot of the same rhetoric gets recycled among these right-wing environmentalists. What Herbert Gruhl argued for in that book and in lots of other texts at the time was an authoritarian eco-state. Some people would say he argued for an eco-dictatorship. That we could argue about that. That's potentially debatable, but he definitely argued for an authoritarian eco-state, a strong state that would strictly limit reproduction, strictly limit how many humans there were allowed to be in the following generations, and that would basically ban immigration. Not entirely ban it, but restrict immigration very, very severely. So once again, overpopulation, supposed forms of overpopulation were central to, in this case, German versions of right-wing environmentalism. This is not a specifically American phenomenon. It's not a specifically German phenomenon. We could give you examples from France, from Russia, from Spain, from Australia, and so on and so forth. I want to note, not all of the examples I mentioned necessarily belong to the right. Someone like Paul Ehrlich, there's right-wing strands in his thinking, but Ehrlich himself viewed himself as a progressive, and he was usually viewed as a progressive by other progressives. So I'm definitely not trying to say that this phenomenon of overpopulation in an environmental context, it's not unique to the far right. By no means. It is definitely not restricted to the far right. On the contrary, overpopulation is a topic that brings together liberals and conservatives. It brings together progressives with reactionaries. It seems to present itself as simple common sense. So in today's world, for example, liberal population policy nonprofits, in the NGO world, as we say in English, in the nonprofit world, or any number of mainstream environmental outfits, they often share the exact same underlying assumptions. They try not to put them in blatantly anti-immigrant context. They try not to put them in blatantly racist terms, but a lot of the underlying assumptions are strikingly similar. Okay, so the question then becomes, if this is a phenomenon that runs across the political spectrum, left, right, and center, what do these arguments have in common? The main thing I would mention, among many possible ones, is the basic underlying assumption behind all forms of Malthusianism, so-called Malthusianism, behind all forms of overpopulation discourse in an environmental context. The central underlying assumption is reducing the social to the biological, taking highly complex human social relations, human social structures, and reducing them to relatively simple biological, quote, laws, unquote. You will see reference to natural laws all over any discussion, especially any openly right-wing discussion of overpopulation discourse, reducing the social to the biological. I think that's the main strand and the most important one for us to understand. But there's a second one that also is crucial for us to keep in mind, and that is what I would call a kind of false universalism. A false universalism that points to, quote, humankind as the main culprit. When you're trying to figure out, okay, who's responsible for the rapid destruction of biodiversity around the planet, or even just, if you just want to look at it from a climate change, from a climate activist point of view, who's primarily responsible for the rapid increase in greenhouse gases and the increasing urgency of the climate crisis? This false universalism, as I'm calling it, it basically says the answer to that question is simple. It's humankind as a whole that is at fault. Now, even people in radical contexts slip into that language from time to time. I slip into it myself, and I study it. So that's a problem. If even people who pay close critical attention to this phenomenon still find ourselves unconsciously repeating it, that's an indication of how deep-seated some of these assumptions are. Now, the obvious difficulty, the obvious flaw in that notion of blaming humankind as a whole, the obvious problem there is it overlooks all of the absolutely crucial distinctions among different kinds of human communities. It overlooks class distinctions. It overlooks gender distinctions. It overlooks even simple distinctions like who's got all the money and wealth and who has none of the money and wealth in the world. That's a big problem. Last but not least, and that's why, by the way, that rhetoric of climate change in right-wing contexts consistently gets tied to an anti-immigrant and anti-immigration agenda. Last but not least, I would say the most hidden conceptual flaw here, the one that's least obvious to outside observers, is an unspoken politics of race. For many, many, many right-wing environmental thinkers who make overpopulation one of their central themes, that rhetoric of overpopulation, for them, for right-wing environmentalists, the rhetoric of overpopulation is a handy way to present essentially the same racial arguments that you would expect from any person on the far right, while removing any explicit reference to race. That's the handy thing about saying humankind is the culprit. You don't have to actually specify, oh, by the way, we mean all the brown people who live in the global south, some of whom are annoyingly trying to cross into, quote, our countries, trying to cross borders and migrate to wherever, to Britain, to France, to Germany, to the United States, what have you. Invoking overpopulation in that context allows right-wingers to get their racial message across without having to spell it out explicitly. And that's one of several reasons why it's become such a popular topic among right-wing environmentalists. Okay, I've used up a lot of my time. Let's take 8 more minutes here. And I want to offer some possible starting points for a critical analysis of these ideas. So far, I've largely just presented right-wing environmentalist ideas, and the whole point behind this lecture series, this discussion series, is to offer critical approaches to that. I want to start with that underlying notion of reducing the social to the biological. That is a problem that extends far beyond just overpopulation discourse. If you look at almost any variant of right-wing environmentalism in today's world, you will see the same pattern of biologizing social relations, taking a set of human social structures, and instead of looking at them as social structures, instead translating those things into biological terms. I'm going to call that biologizing human social relationships. You see that in everything from the very popular notion of society as an organism, a very popular notion among many environmentalists. You see it in even things like the concept of Lebensraum, which every German here will immediately recognize. Some of the English speakers will at least know that term. That was a term that was originated in ecological context and then got transferred onto human social context with disastrous consequences. So I want those of us who oppose right-wing forms of environmentalism, I want us to take that underlying conceptual move seriously. I want us to be very aware of, very attentive to, anytime someone takes a human social relation, anytime someone takes a complex social structure like global capitalism, like the nation state, anytime someone takes one of those complex social structures and reduces it down and biologizes it, anytime we see that happen, that should be a warning. That should be a chance for us to step back and say, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? That's number one. Number two is a controversial question. I'm going to give my own answer to the question, but my guess is that at least some of you here today probably take the opposite answer to this question. And the question is this. When we look at these right-wing forms of environmentalism, regardless of whether we're talking about their obsession with overpopulation or just talking about them in general, when we look at right-wing forms of environmentalism, should we see them, number one, as simply old-style, far-right, anti-immigrant hostility that has just been dressed up in new green clothing because today green is the way to be popular and modern and cool? Should we see it as kind of a cover for something else? That would be option one. Or option two, I argue for option two, should we see these forms of right-wing environmentalism as a genuine commitment to ecological ideals as those ideals are understood from the right? I think number two is the more accurate answer. In many cases, we could argue about specific right-wingers. There are some who are basically using their environmental rhetoric as nothing but a cover-up. But in many, many other cases, in my view, as an external critical analyst of right-wing environmentalism, in many, many, many cases, they actually mean what they are saying. From their right-wing point of view, there is a kind of logic at work. They think it all makes sense. They think that the close the borders, oppose immigrants, protect, quote, our natural resources. They see all of those things as all of a piece, as all part of a coherent whole. They are not just pretending to be environmentalists. They really are being environmentalists as the far right understands the politics of nature. Again, that's a very important debate, something that we could argue about. Okay, to close, I'm going to skip about a third of the stuff that I prepared here, but I want to leave a lot of time for discussion. I want to talk about how we could frame our counter arguments. My working assumption here is if you've come to this discussion, or if you're going to watch it later on YouTube, I'm going to guess that you probably came here because you don't like right-wing forms of environmentalism, and you're looking for ways to combat them. So I want to think about some ways for how we could frame, how radical climate activists could frame counter arguments. One way is to think about what the rhetoric of overpopulation actually signifies. What does the rhetoric of overpopulation stand for? What does it point toward in the wider world of right-wing environmental thought? And when you take that approach, you might say, I will say, and some of you might agree, that the problem isn't so much that overpopulation frameworks give us the wrong answers, even though they do give us the wrong answers. The underlying problem, I would argue, is that overpopulation frameworks are asking the wrong questions in the first place. It's not just that the answers that they offer are false and misleading and make no sense. It's that the very way they have formulated the important ecological questions, the important political questions, it's already misguided from the start. Here's an example of what I mean. The next time you hear somebody say, we can't let the population in Africa or Indonesia or India, or pick your favorite country in the global south, your favorite part of the global south, the next time you hear somebody say, we can't let the population in Africa increase at the rate that it is currently increasing, there's no way our resources can withstand it. A relatively simple thing to respond would be to say, okay, look at the ecological footprint of any given individual, like me, Peter Staudenmaier, here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the city where I live, or like some of you in, I don't know where you live, but maybe you're in Hamburg or Berlin, in Munich. Look at the standard ecological footprint of a white middle-class urban dweller in the global north. And look how much that radically outweighs the ecological footprint of an impoverished peasant in the global south. You could answer the question that way. And if you did answer that question that way, you'd be onto something. There's a good reason to take that approach to answering that question. But my argument is, don't even answer the question that way. Instead of saying, well, look at the individual ecological footprint of a person in the Wisconsin versus a person in Namibia, instead what we can say is, let's critique the whole notion of an individual ecological footprint. Let's step back and say, why are we even considering this question from the point of view of my individual impact on global processes of warming and biodiversity loss and species and habitat destruction? In other words, the problem with right-wing versions of overpopulation talk, the problem is not just that they shift the blame from the rich to the poor. The problem is deeper than that. The problem is that right-wing overpopulation talk, in fact, I would say the problem with all forms of environmental overpopulation talk is that it obscures the systematic underpinnings of the social structures that we should be paying critical attention to. It distracts our attention away from things like the history of global capitalism, or if you're like me, the history of the nation state. Instead of looking at those social structures that have created the ecological crisis in the first place, overpopulation discourses take our attention away from that, and instead we look at things at what's my personal consumption level? What are my personal individual consumer choices? I do not mean to dismiss those issues, but if you ask me, the structures of global capitalism and the nation state are going to outweigh any given individual's consumption patterns, consumer choices, or what have you. Okay, to conclude very briefly, and then we can move into some discussion. I want to say that it is worth our time and effort. It is worth the time and effort of climate activists who believe in an emancipatory climate movement, not a repressive right-wing climate movement. But for those of us who believe in an emancipatory climate movement, it is worth our effort. It's worth the effort for climate activists to try to take the seemingly bizarre logic of right-wing environmentalism seriously and to try to understand it at least a little bit. Not just taking its obsession with overpopulation seriously, not just taking its animosity toward immigrant communities seriously, but taking its entire approach to ecological questions as such seriously. I'm asking us, for those of us who oppose right-wing and far right-wing involvement in such environmental questions, who are critical of that involvement, I'm asking us to try to understand what drives right-wing environmentalists, what motivates them, what is their own internal reasoning, their own internal logic. So we need to try to figure out not just what is the role of overpopulation discourse in right-wing environmentalism, but how does that fit in with all of the other disparate elements that make up a right-wing ecological worldview. Because once we have, here's my closing argument, once we have a better understanding of that distorted worldview, once we have a better grasp on how right-wing ecology sees social reality, we will then be able to confront that distorted worldview with critical analyses, possibly including some of the ones that we've mentioned here today already. And more importantly than just confronting it with critical analysis, we will also be in a better position to oppose right-wing ecology. We can oppose it with a radically different vision of our planet's future. For that matter, a radically different vision of our society's future, of the futures of our societies, plural. We can use, instead of the right-wing version of a hierarchical and authoritarian eco-whatever, we can instead oppose that with an inclusive vision based on solidarity across borders. If right-wing environmentalists blame immigrants, part of our job is to embrace immigrant communities and say, let's start working together on this underlying problem. Where do climate refugees come from in the first place? Unbridled climate change, the failure of countries in the global north to do anything to their emissions and so forth. So we can oppose that with an inclusive vision based on solidarity across borders. We can oppose the anti-democratic right-wing environmentalism with a genuinely democratic vision, one that is based on participation. But when I say democratic, I mean a grassroots, bottom-up democratic vision based on participatory democracy, based on social equality. And last but not least, we can oppose the authoritarian vision of right-wing environmentalism, which is the core value for right-wing environmentalists. We can oppose their authoritarianism with an explicitly anti-authoritarian counter vision, a vision that's based not on restrictions and on prohibitions, but on lived alternatives, on ideas and practices that we've actually tried out ourselves, on however small a scale that might be, on ideas and practices that point beyond capitalism, that point beyond the nation state, and that point toward a society in which every person, regardless of the color of their skin, regardless of their religious background or affiliation, where every single person has a part to play in creating a sustainable world. Okay, that is a lot all at once. I'm not sure how much of it Laura and others were able to follow through on, but I would love to hear some comments, some critical observations, some questions, and some discussion points.
Wow. Thank you so much. That was amazing. Honestly, really, really great talk. Thank you so much. We had so much outpouring of amazement and support from the chat, from our own internal chat. And I'm sure that the main chat also has many messages of love and support, and also many questions. You actually answered all of my questions perfectly in the talk. So I'm going to shut up now and give the word to Luisa for now to field the questions. And I might jump in later with some of the chat questions as well. Thank you so much. Really great talk.
Well, I can just say the same. Thank you so much for this really, really amazing talk. I think it's now like the 7th event that we had, and I felt before, well, what new is there to hear? So, but now I heard you talk and I was like, okay, this is just overwhelming. For all the people listening, yes, I think the chat is now online again, so you have all the time you need. I mean, you people listening in the chat, and just think about questions that you have for Peter and put them in the chat. If it's in English or German, do whatever you feel more comfortable with, and we are able to translate. I think, Peter, you said that we could also do the discussion now in German. Jakob and I just talked that I think there are some people listening from or watching from the US, so I feel that we should stick to English.
Okay,
and then we have the German translation, but yeah, I think that might be best for all of us. So I'm going to start with 2 questions that I have, and now the chat is online. We'll have a look at that one. But first, let me start. So you were saying, and I really, really agree with that what we need as a climate movement is a better understanding. And I really like the term biologizing. I haven't actually heard of that before. And I was wondering, like, really this concept of taking some social constructs and social relations and trying to naturalize it, which I understood as being biologizing. How can we, like we as a movement or we individually, become more aware of this process if people do it? And I was wondering if you have any recommendations in terms of readings, books, or I don't know, some YouTube channels that you can recommend. So all of us who are listening right now and who will be watching this video maybe in the future can look it up and just, I don't know, get more aware of this process and thinking. Oh, you have to turn on your voice again. Oh, yeah.
My microphone. Should I just take one question at a time? Is that the idea?
I think that's how we can start, and then we'll see how many questions we get.
Terrific. Thank you, Louisa. That is an excellent question, and I do not have an excellent answer to offer, but I can try to offer a good enough answer. I like your word, in some ways even better, naturalizing social relations. I think when I first started writing on these topics, which is 1,000 years ago now, I think I probably used that terminology of naturalizing social relations, and I don't remember, to be honest, why I switched and started talking about biologizing social relations. There is a tradition of talking about that in German, for what it's worth. Biologisierung der sozialen Verhältnisse, oder was weiß ich. So that exists, that terminology is out there. But what I'm really getting at, you're right, is more the phenomenon of taking aspects of the social world and speaking as if they were naturally given. And that is a really, really difficult habit to get ourselves out of. Those habits are, I would say, they're very deeply ingrained in many human cultures. Well, in many Western cultures. I'll stop myself there because I don't know enough about most non-Western cultures, but it's deeply ingrained in the English-speaking world that I grew up in, the German-speaking world that I live my professional life in. Even the words we use to respond in totally everyday situations. When we say in English, well, naturally, which is a very common response. Somebody says something and you think it's totally obvious. We say, well, naturally. In German, they say, ja, natürlich. Yes, of course. We use those. If you think about the literal meaning of those phrases, there's nothing natural about what you're responding to by saying, well, yes, naturally. It's not natural. It's the result of social processes. It's the cumulative result of a series of decisions that various groups of human beings have made over the years. Now, a lot of us people involved in the climate movement, people who've been ecological activists for a while, we know this intellectually. We know that capitalism is not a natural phenomenon. It didn't just grow out of the soil. It's a specific social structure. It has historical origins. We can trace it back. We could argue for days on end about exactly where its historical origins lie, but we know it's not a natural given. We know it's a social construct. The trick is to bring that insight into our everyday interactions and to try to somehow gently remind ourselves that virtually everything important in the social realm is similarly the result of social structures and social processes. Very, very, very few of the important things about the ways our societies are structured, very few of those things can actually be traced directly back to any sort of natural or pre-social origins. And my hope is that once we can remind ourselves to take a more critical approach to that very way of talking, to saying, well, naturally it is the case that if we can remind ourselves to do that in everyday situations, maybe we'll be better able to do it when the really important questions, the challenging questions confront us.
Well, that sounds convincing, or at least a way to start. And so as for my question, I would just suggest for all of us just to read your books, because I feel like you actually know a lot about that, and I feel like I have to read them all. So because you already touched another question, and then I will head over and give room for the questions that we have in the chat. But one last question from my side. You tackled those concepts, which all of us probably, or most of us know, which are called like planetary boundaries or ecological footprints. So there are some concepts which are widely known. And I was wondering, because you visibly made the connections between how those concepts easily imply an ecological boundary, which is then somehow turning over to this overpopulation thing. So I was wondering, are those concepts, the ecological footprint, and also like this planetary boundary, or whatever you want to call it, are those also concepts that we should look at more critically? Or should we start already there? Or where do you say, which concepts could we still use in a very emancipatory way and use those environmental research? And when is the point that we should get more aware and be like, oh, this is now getting critical? So maybe you want to say something about that.
That's a terrific question. My critique of the ecological footprint idea, and this is just my critique. There are radical ecological thinkers out there with a strongly emancipatory approach who have very positive things to say about the notion of an ecological footprint. So this is just me talking. My own suspicions of that concept have much more to do with its individualist basis. It's not that I'm opposed to the notion of an ecological footprint. I find it highly suspect when we apply that notion at an individual level that makes us think about our personal consumption habits instead of thinking systemically, instead of thinking about the structures within which any individual's personal habits are inevitably anchored. Everything we do personally is anchored in some way in the social structures that we are part of. So that's where that particular critique came from in my case. My critique of the notion of planetary boundaries is not as harsh. I see a number of important insights embedded within that classic notion of planetary boundaries. I tried to, a half hour ago or so, when I briefly mentioned the Club of Rome and its report from 1972, The Limits to Growth, I tried to briefly indicate that I don't reject everything in that discourse. Some of those claims, and especially some of the 21st century versions of the 7 or the 9, I've now forgotten the number, the 9 planetary boundaries and tipping points. I don't think all of that should just be tossed out the window. I do think that a lot of it should probably be rethought. I think it would be good if we could critically re-examine some of the assumptions that lie behind the whole notion of boundaries. And one of the tricky things here is, how do I put this? I'm not a scientist. I'm a historian. I'm not a natural scientist. I'm not an ecologist. I'm not a zoologist. I'm not a meteorologist. I can't do that sort of stuff. That's not my area of expertise. What I try to do is follow the current scientific discussions to the extent that I can, to the extent that they are accessible to a non-specialist like me. I try to follow them, I try to understand them, and I try to make sense of them. But there are occasions where it seems to me climate activists and ecological activists more broadly, there are times where I think we are justified in posing critical questions to the scientists even though in general the scientists are our allies. We are not in the notes that I sent to your translator beforehand. I had a whole paragraph about how climate activists are really different from the Querdenker milieu. For the English listeners, I would translate that as the contrarian milieu, the self-described contrarians, people in Germany and Switzerland and Austria who think that Corona is a fake and they call it the pandemic and Bill Gates is behind it and don't get vaccinated because the world order will control you. All of that conspiratorial nonsense. Those people, they oppose the science as such. I want us to not be like that. I want radical climate activists to take the science very seriously, to respect the findings that scientists are coming up with, but at the same time, to at least be willing to question the way those findings are formulated, the way those findings are framed for public discussion. To choose just one example, it's really tempting to take an extraordinarily complex set of dynamic processes like the Earth's atmosphere. Atmospheric dynamics are astonishingly complex. That's why we're so bad at predicting the weather. That's why we're terribly bad. Professional meteorologists who have PhDs in doing this and get paid money to try to predict the weather get it wrong half the time. And it's not their fault. The systems are so fantastically complex and dynamic. Dynamic as opposed to static. They're not simple moving in one direction. They're moving in 1,000 different directions at once. Because we know that's true, it can be tempting to reduce some of those enormously complex and dynamic symptoms down to something that we can easily compare on a chart. If you can quantify it, there's the seductive appeal of quantification. If you can pin a number on it and compare that number to this number and have a nice little chart, that seems like it'll make it easier for the rest of us to understand. For those of us who do not have PhDs in atmospheric science, if we just put it into numbers on a chart, maybe then we'll get it. I understand the appeal of that quantification, but I still want us to resist it. I want us to say, actually, some of these processes cannot be so easily reduced to a single set of numbers that you can then compare back and forth. The whole system is trickier than that, just like our social systems can't be simply reduced to what are the personal consumer choices that one guy in Wisconsin makes. The social systems and the natural systems, we want to respect their extraordinarily complex nature. So I am somewhat skeptical of some versions of the planetary boundaries discourse. I think some of it is vastly oversimplified, and I think some of it is alarmist. Some of it operates on the assumption that if we just scare people enough, they'll finally start to act. I am really skeptical of that notion. I don't see that much use out of alarmism. I think what really moves people to act is when you can show them a story, when you can show them a narrative, when you can give them a set of explanations. Well, how did we get here? What the heck happened in 1856 or 1972 or wherever you want to trace it back to? How do we get to where we are historically? And if you can show them alternatives, not just imaginary alternatives, nothing wrong with imagination, but not just purely speculative alternatives, but actual, what I called before, lived alternatives. When you point to things that some people are already doing around the world on a small scale, where if we were able to scale them up, get broader social support for them, maybe we could have actual effective counterweights to the seemingly unstoppable process of climate change under current political and economic regimes. That's what I think can help change people's mind more than a chart that scares the shit out of them and says, oh my God, it's all over. We have until 2023 to change and it's already 2021. That would be my argument.
Well, thank you for that very clear statement. And I know Jacob and I had a lot of questions prepared asking you about what we should do to make the movement more aware, but you already answered all of them. So I think now is the time. I'll go over to you, Jacob, because we also want to get back to the right-wing perspective, or I think it's not even a perspective. It's part of the overpopulation term. And I think there were some really good questions in the chat, and Jacob, you had a look at them.
Yeah, I'm actually going to try to combine a few because we don't have that much time left. And I'm going to butcher a few. Sorry about that. Just in case you have troubles with not seeing the chat, just refresh your browser window and the chat should appear. So one question that I found really interesting was the connection between this overpopulation idea and feminism. And on the one hand, the liberal idea of, okay, we need to free the bodies of the women in the global south from reproductive work and have to give them all IUDs if they want them. And then also the anti-colonial, anti-racist, feminist protest against this. Not sure if you're an expert on this, but maybe you can say a few words about that topic.
I'm not an expert on that, but you remind me with that fantastic question that I did something no male presenter should ever do. I skipped specifically those parts of my prepared presentation that were exactly about feminist perspectives. And I apologize for that. I was running out of time and I had to skip a bunch of stuff. No, I'm not an expert, but this is a good example of the ways that non-experts can learn a remarkable amount from reading the work of some of the people you just mentioned, some of the critiques that have come from feminists in the global south, and from some of the critiques that have come just from general global north or global south, general feminist work on reproductive freedom. There's a really rich tradition. I have a couple of those books somewhere here. I could show you a few of them. One of the old ones is called Dangerous Intersections. Sorry, these are all in English. My German books are in a different pile. It's, I don't know, 1998 or something like that, but it's still very powerful today. A newer book is by Alison Bashford. She's a fantastic scholar of she is the go-to scholar about the whole discussion about what is population, how and why does it matter environmentally. The number one book that I would recommend is relatively new. It's so new that I don't have my copy in front of me. I have a copy somewhere, and it's in a pile somewhere. I apologize. That's by a woman named Jade Sasser, Sasser. Her first name is Jade, Jade, and the book is called On Infertile Ground. If you give me a second, I can find the subtitle. On Infertile Ground, Population Control and Women's Rights in the Era of Climate Change. New York University Press, 2018. Really, really, really hard-hitting, powerful book. My guess is that you had Maya Goodfellow on a couple of weeks ago, didn't you? My guess is, I don't know her, I just know her work, but my guess is that she probably knows that discussion and knows that body of scholarship better than I do. But there's a lot of stuff like that out there, and it doesn't just have to come from scholars. I'm an academic, so for better or worse, I tend to fall back on people who are thoroughly immersed in this research and can write monographs with 1,000 footnotes, but it's not that hard to find online resources that offer a really similar set of critiques. If you're looking for good journalistic approaches that don't necessarily have all the scholarly apparatus or something like that, Betsy Hartman would be probably the one name I would mention. Hartman, Hartmann. Betsy, she writes in English. That's some really terrific work on the complicated junctures between feminist emphasis on reproductive freedom and the seemingly converging but actually diverging environmental emphasis on some environmentalists emphasizing population control, population stabilization, etc. Part of the argument that Hartman and Sasser and others present is there is something deeply wrong-headed about those environmental analyses because they essentially put the entire burden of the global environmental challenge, they place that burden on the bodies of women in the developing world, the bodies of women in the global south, the bodies of non-white women who don't have access to the resources and everything else. And they really want us as their readers to critically rethink the assumptions that some of us bring to those difficult and contradictory discussions around what's our number one priority? Is it stabilizing population, or is it instead giving women everywhere, regardless of their access to other resources, giving them access to the resources they need to control at least some of their own reproductive choices? What's the real priority? And when you get down into the details of that, it can lead to some hard conversations. Part of Jade Sasser's work involved going and working with mainstream environmental outfits in the aughts, I think, in the first decade of the 21st century, if I recall correctly. And she's a woman of color herself, and she tells her readers about a series of really hard discussions that she had with her mostly white, mostly liberal, mostly middle-class interlocutors in some of those situations. Those are hard questions. Some of the things I've addressed today, I think, are easy. You can tell who the bad guys are and who the good guys are. This is not one of those instances. This is an instance where people of goodwill and people of good conscience are both trying to do what they think is the right thing, but at least one side of that hasn't necessarily thought through their own background assumptions.
Perfect. I think that's the best approach to just give us a bunch of books and that explain this idea very well. So thank you so much for that. It's very impressive how knowledgeable you are about this topic in general. So there were a few more questions in the chat about how you think, if you can do some gazing into the crystal ball, how you think the mainstream or the conservative mainstream will use these overpopulation arguments in the future. And this is kind of coupled with the whole idea of individualizing the climate change issue and like pinning it on certain people and moving it away from the systemic. Do you have some ideas how this discourse will evolve in the mainstream?
I have ideas. I'm not particularly confident in my own ability to make worthwhile predictions along those lines. Historians in particular, because that's my training, that's my field. I would say historians in particular are often really bad at predicting the future. I know I am. Anyway, I'm happy to share them with you, but I would not give my own hunches about the future any special weight. I'm certain that a number of you here participating today know more about this than I do. But my own hunch would be, since it's a really good, smart question, my own guess would be that over the next 10 years or so, I would expect overpopulation discourse to simultaneously make more and more inroads within the mainstream. That is to say, I expect it to become more common, more popular, if you will, more openly and widely discussed in mainstream media, among conservatives and liberals, among centrists, across the large middle chunk of the political spectrum. At the same time, though, I expect that discourse to eventually to differentiate, to start breaking apart, and not just being one unified overpopulation discourse, but instead I think we're going to see increasingly diverging population discourses, plural, some of which in places like the United States and Germany, some of which will pay really close attention to it's the birth rates, it's the birth rates, it's the birth rates. We'll pay really close attention to the astonishing decline in birth rates in places where I live. I live in the U.S., we call it the upper Midwest. It's where those great big lakes are, where the Great Lakes are. I live north of Chicago, if you know where that is. In this part of the United States, because I'm a professor at a college, I teach at a university, my university pays very close attention to predicting its own future so it knows what enrollments to expect. How many 18-year-olds do we think will want to go to college in 2022 and 2026 and 2030? And when they look forward, they see a steep decline. Where I live in the upper Midwest, there will be fewer and fewer 18-year-olds. Hence, fewer and fewer 18-year-olds will want to go to college or go to my college or whatever. So you see a steep demographic decline, not a rise, but a decline. And that is becoming a bigger and bigger part of discourses in mainstream media in general. Whether or not it's connected to an environmental outlook is a separate question. What worries me about that discussion is how easily it can become racialized. And like I said before, it can sometimes become racialized without even explicitly mentioning race, which is a gift to the far right. The more they can get their racial message across without having to, in English we would say, without having to lay their cards on the table, without having to show everyone, yeah, we're really talking about race. In fact, we've actually been talking about race the whole time, even though we never mentioned race. As long as we let them get away with that, that's a problem. part of the job of radical environmental activists, people who take an emancipatory approach to environmental questions, has to be to poke holes in right-wing versions of environmental thought by revealing their hidden racial assumptions, their unstated racial assumptions. And part of my worry is that those assumptions will become more and more open in the coming years, at least in the United States. I haven't been to Germany in a couple of years now because of the pandemic and other reasons, but at least in the United States, I think it is now increasingly likely to encounter open white supremacist talk in mainstream media, not just from Trump or his allies, but from all sorts of people. I see that being more common rather than less common. And that's an important historical lesson. If you have the image in your mind that in general things are getting better historically, at least open forms of chattel slavery, those were finally abolished in the 19th century. At least women can now vote as of 1919 in the United States, as of 1971 in Switzerland. But at least women around the world, or much of the world, can now vote. Things are getting slowly better. If you have that image in your mind, I want to ask you to rethink it. I want to ask you to think really long and hard about just what is getting better and for whom, and maybe what is getting worse and for whom. As a historian, I don't think history moves in one direction. I think history is constantly moving in multiple directions at once. Some stuff is getting, quote, better. Some stuff is getting a whole lot worse. And we have no reasonable expectation that openly racist discourses that we might have thought had been banished from the public sphere 20 years ago, they're now reappearing. So when I look forward 5 or 10 years, I see real challenges on the horizon.
Thank you so much. That was a really good point. I think we have time for one more question, I would say. Louisa?
Yes, I would say so too. I mean, we've been listening to you for now, 1.5 hours, but I'm still I could listen to you the whole night.
And just in case you are in the chat, Peter, there's so much pluses and hearts for you, and everybody's really, really happy about your presentation. Thank you so much again, also from them. Sorry, Lisa.
I can't see the public chat, unfortunately. I just see the moderator's chat. Thank you for mentioning it.
We'll give you a screenshot of the chat afterwards. Yes, so we're going to take 5 more minutes, and I think then we're all going to be headed off for the night. But they're so good questions, and I'll just take 2 of them. I think the one, and it was raised right at the beginning, there was a person asking about if you could go a little bit into the tragedy of the commons topic, because you somehow slightly talked about it and how you are a little critical about it, and maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit. And I'll give you another question, so you know that you have 2 questions to answer in 4 minutes. And I think that's really interesting. It's a question about the difference between a systematic thinking or systemic thinking and what you call holistic, or there's a German word for it, which is Ganzheitlichkeit, which is also often used by far-right people. And so, how can we distinguish between this systemic view and thinking, which is needed to understand the concepts which are really complex, and how can we differentiate between the Ganzheitlichkeit and the often misused concepts from other people?
Those are terrific questions. I missed a little, my internet got weird for a minute, so I missed a little bit of the second question, but I got the end of it, the systemic versus holistic part. The question about the tragedy of the commons is a great question. There's already a very good critical literature out there, not written by me, but by other people who have taken Hardin's. This is the idea that goes back to that 1968 article by Garrett Hardin. So we have those who want to get a better and fuller, more critical understanding of that to my mind, preposterously wrong-headed notion of the tragedy of the commons. You have a lot of options out there. The very, very short versions say that what Hardin did was he took a kind of a thought experiment based on the so-called practice of enclosure. Boy, this is I don't want to go into the long history here, but in parts of early modern Europe, when previously commonly held areas were gradually encroached upon and made smaller and smaller, eventually privatized entirely. So Hardin was looking at a real set of historical processes. He didn't make it up. He didn't imagine it, but he misunderstood those historical processes in virtually every way possible. He misunderstood if you ask me, every single aspect of it, and he hence drew exactly the wrong conclusions. Because I don't want to spend too much time, I'll sort of leave it there. But for those of you who've actually read the essay Tragedy of the Commons, before you go look at all the critiques of it out there, from the point of view of an anti-capitalist, and I don't care what kind of anti-capitalist, if you're a Marxist, if you're an anarchist, if you're a feminist opponent of capitalism, from the point of view of any anti-capitalist, the so-called solution to the supposed tragedy of the commons is right in front of Hardin's eyes. Hardin wants us to stop keeping land in common so that the individual cattle owners can keep, feeding their cattle. And to my mind, I thought this back in high school. I was made to read this. This article is so famous, they make you read it in ethics classes in high school and college in the United States. It's a really famous article. And when I first read it, I thought, you're crazy, dude. The obvious answer here is to socialize the ownership of cattle. Don't privatize the ownership of the grounds where they feed, of the grasslands. Make the cattle commonly owned, you fool. Stop making them privately owned. It seems very obvious to any anti-capitalist, but it was not obvious to Gerhard Hardin at the time, or to his many admirers. So anyway, that's my extremely simple, I came up with that bright idea when I was 18 years old or something. So go look at some of the better material that's out there critiquing the so-called tragedy of the commons. That last question is excellent, and it's a challenge to me. I see some important distinctions between what I'm trying to call a systemic or a structural approach and a ganzheitlich or a holistic approach. I think there are genuinely important conceptual differences there, but I will concede they're maybe not as far apart as I might like. In some ways, I am asking us to engage in some tricky tightrope walking. I want us to be able to navigate a kind of a fine line between right-wing versions of environmental thought that ignore all the social complexities, but also, on the other side, we have some versions of left-wing thought that completely fail to take ecological questions seriously. That is unfortunately a long-standing tradition on the left in the US and Germany and lots of other parts of the world. So our challenge, we actually face a double challenge here. We don't want to fall off the tightrope in this direction, and we don't want to fall off the tightrope in that direction. So I will concede that some of what I'm saying may seem uncomfortably close to a holistic point of view. The major distinction I would draw has to do with something I'll call thinking dialectically. I'm not a Marxist. I think Jakob mentioned before that I've been an anarchist my entire adult life. I'm actually harshly critical of many aspects of Marxism for what it's worth. But I do think that various traditions within Marxist thought have done a pretty good job of coming up with powerfully thought-through critiques of that holistic paradigm. And one of their major critiques is to say holism takes the right culprit. Holism looks at the dualistic traditions in mainstream thought, the long-standing dualisms, the whatever it is, light versus dark, top versus bottom, what have you, society versus nature, those dualisms that are really built into many human societies and many cultures. Holism comes and takes those dualisms, rightly takes them to task. It rightly critiques those dualisms, but it wrongly comes up with a kind of unified version. It reduces the dualism to oneness, to a we're all in this together kind of holism. Whereas a radical critique, many of the Marxist critics of holism would argue that a genuinely radical critique looks at dualism and doesn't reduce it down to oneness. It instead explodes it into a huge variety of thousands of different components, thousands of different dynamic factors that are all going on at the same time. It's not just a simple 1-2, either nature or society, and it's certainly not that we're all really one when you just get down to the bottom of it. Can't we all just get along? A radical critique would say, why can't we all just be one? What are the social structures that stand in the way of human beings embracing each other in a way that is based on solidarity, in a way that is based on genuine affinities, in a way that is welcoming rather than exclusive, that includes people rather than pushing them away? If some of us want to do that, and we want to do it now, what is it that's standing in the way of us doing that? And it's not just our assumptions. It's not just our mental paradigms. It's not just our inability to take a genuinely holistic viewpoint. There are actual societal creations. I would point to things like capitalism and the nation state, but you could point to a lot of others. Racial hierarchies, gender hierarchies, what have you. There are a lot of social structures that make that kind of solidarity impossible. So we need to change those structures and not just change our underlying assumptions if we want to actually get to a different kind of world. That's the best I can do in answering extraordinarily wonderful, sophisticated questions. Thank you so much.
Well, I would say we can just leave it to that. I think those were the best finishing words that I would never have come up with. So, well, thank you. I think we have to change the structure. I think this is what I can take out of this, at least just one little part of it, because you talked about so much more. I also look at the time, and we've been talking for almost 2 hours now. I think even though there are more questions, and there are a lot of people thanking you a lot and saying you're such an inspiration, I just want to give it over to you because the chat is just booming. And I just agree. I think it was really inspiring to hear you talk and give your answers to the questions. And I was wondering if there's anything that you would recommend. Are there any, I don't know, events or things that you would say those are the things that you have to look at? Because I'm going to do some advertising after that, so now's your time, and then I'm going to tell everybody what's this demo about, which I have the picture in the chat.
Okay, bitte fällt. I should have thought of those beforehand. I apologize. I don't have ones at the tip of my actions or upcoming events that I could point to. What I could say, two things, is Jakob mentioned at the very beginning that I work with this small organization called the Institute for Social Ecology. So does Hillary Moore, by the way. You saw her maybe 3 weeks ago or something. She's an old friend and comrade of mine. We both work with this place called the Institute for Social Ecology. So if you want to look that up online, my guess is their website will have more recent events in mind, more recent current events than I'm able to come up with right now. The other offer I can make in somewhat restricted form is I would be happy to correspond over email. I don't want to necessarily commit myself to answering 100,000 questions, but I do see this as part of my duty as a public scholar, as someone who takes my commitments to the general public very seriously. So please don't hesitate to contact me if you think I can offer useful background or more reading suggestions or something like that. I am more than happy to do that. But aside from that, I would say you guys are already on top of this. As far as I can tell, from the amazing lecture series you've already organized, you have thought through a lot of these questions in a really smart way. You've got a demonstration coming up in a couple of weeks. So I would say trust your own activist instincts about this and keep doing what you're doing. Thank you for having me here. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I think that's just a great overview to get to the next topic. So the demonstration is actually, I think we talked about that last week already. This comes from an event that we had, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, where we talked about violence from right-wing groups or individuals against activists from either the social or the environmental climate movement. And there's this demonstration coming up very soon. I think it's Friday, July 9th, and it's happening in Bitterfeld, which is really you could say somewhere in nowhere, but it's actually in Sachsen-Anhalt. And the people that we heard or listened to 3 weeks ago, they were saying that we need more people coming to this demonstration to say that we're not forgetting them and that we are like listening to them, and that's a big issue that there are people experiencing those violence. So I think it's a really good thing to get there and mobilize your people. So this is the advertisement for that. And also, I just wanted to say that there are 2 more events coming up. I think it's actually, we're getting to the finish line of this event series. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about like real stuff, positively and negatively, in terms of talking about real political happenings. Because looking at Germany, there might be a green-black coalition coming up. And I think a lot of people that are active in the climate movement or somewhere else have been considering that and have been wondering, what is our perspective on that? What does it mean in terms of racist and green things coming together? If we look at Austria, we see this protect the climate and protect the borders thing. And I think it's no surprise, or it wouldn't be a surprise, if the same thing's happening in Germany. So I think this is what we want to talk about next week. And we have some people from different organizations, also from Austria probably, who will be talking about that with us. And the event is going to be in German. So for all of you who are able to listen, we'll be happy to see you. And in 2 weeks, which is going to be our last event, we're actually going to talk with Natascha Ströbel, also a very awesome person. And we're going to talk with her about the corona and climate thing. I think you already touched upon this topic a little bit, Peter, because you were saying that often it's like used in this really weird word of like, oh, this virus is like finally killing us or pushing us back or whatever it is. And I think Natascha Ströbel is going to be able to give a really clear stance about that. And this is going to be our finishing line. So this was long, but I really hope that you enjoyed this night. I really enjoyed it. And I'm looking forward to seeing you next week. And thank you, Peter, again. And see you soon.
Thank you so much.